start with Bala. Are you ready with your presentation? Because the earlier session we've already spoken about the the sort of information warfare was already there. Although we spoke about security threats and challenges, so this is basically a run-on of the earlier session. But here we are getting into most specifics, or rather the basics of what really is misinformation and what is fake news all about. And maybe you can start and drop some sort of a checklist before we get Namrata and Paneer to add on their expertise. So over to you, Bala.
Thank you, sir. So as to save the bandwidth, I have been facing disruptions in connectivity, so I have to switch off my video. My apologies for that. And I'm just sharing my presentation. Yeah, is it visible, sir?
Yeah, it's just coming.
Has it come up? Visible, sir?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I would like to thank Chennai Center for China Studies, Institute for Contemporary Studies, Bangalore, and the Press Institute of India for giving me this opportunity. My special thanks and gratitude to Commodore Vasan sir also for this opportunity. So quickly delving into my presentation, the brief outline, I would be touching on these aspects on just giving an awareness of what constitutes information warfare, and as a corollary and extension, the perception management and China's misinformation campaign. I'll be touching a few aspects on cyber, bringing in some aspects from psychology also, what is called the subliminal messaging, and how China has used it to propagate its values as a part of the Chinese poster culture. And I'll be touching upon China's panda diplomacy and a case study of the Kung Fu Panda movie, and China's integrated network electronic warfare, deepfakes, and why it matters. Why are we talking about these things, and why it is more relevant today. So quickly, getting into my first slide of presentation. Future was, as even Pavitran sir has brought out, data is the new oil, and analytics is going to decide the future scenario. So the future will be and is going to be one of the information superiority. So I take the stand of, I believe in the international theory, the school of realism, school of thought, which believes that the same as in human relations, between the relations between the human states also, the nation states also, they come across competition, disputes, and conflicts of interest, which are inevitable as a part of the international relations. So information has always constituted and always been an important part of the human endeavor. But with the coming of the digital and information revolution, what has happened is it has gained significant momentum in the last decade, which has virtually changed our living and our way of thinking and everything around us. So this in turn, what has happened is that this has impacted on two significant ways. One is this efficiency and effectiveness, it has also increased. On the other hand, it has also made us to rely greater. The greater dependence on information has also happened. So on one way, though, it has given us increasing output and everything, but it has also significantly caused into other issues like vulnerability to disruption, both in the flow and quality as well as quality of information, which has also increased. And all this scenario, with this brief introduction, it has also given rise to the idea of what is called the information warfare. So in simple terms, we don't have a very concrete definition for information warfare, but to put it for the sake of defining, information warfare can be treated as a war on the information spectrum. So this is not only conducted against a country's military capacity, but also against its society and its civil society organizations. So how does the modus operandi happen? It can happen by way of degrading information, delaying information, disruption, or manipulating the flow both at the quantitative and qualitative level of information. For the armed forces, the relevance, the correct and timely information made available to the commanders at all levels constitutes and directly contributes to the effective, what you call the C2 structure, the command and control structure, because they help in shortening the response mechanism, what they call the observe, orient, decide, act cycle, OODA cycle. So what happens is that this information warfare has a vital impact on the first three activities on what you call the observe, orient, and decide loop, because it tends to disrupt the enemy's observation and surveillance system by corrupting his orientation and misguiding his perception. What happens is that it tends to confuse the advisory so that he arrives at the wrong decision. So these are all, there have been different interpretations and of information warfare. These some say this is a part of the RMA, what they call the revolution in military affairs. but some people tend to label it, they also tend to argue that there's nothing new, it all represent an assortment of the existing warfare techniques on the other. But what is common to all these things is that the main aim of all the information warfare is nothing but to target the human mind, the psyche of the adversary or the enemy, both military as well as civil, by denying, degrading, belying, disrupting, and manipulating the flow of quality as well as quantity of information. So, moving on to the next slide, it is about, I'm going to speak about the perception management and China's misinformation campaign. So, what is perception management? Perception management is nothing but a type of psychological operation where it is traditionally supposed to be directed at the foreign audience, but in authoritative regimes like China, it also directed towards a domestic audience to build a suitable narrative. And moving on, there's much of confusion between what it constitutes. So, as I already mentioned, it is a type of psychological operation. China uses this as a part of its misinformation campaign. So here I would like to effectively classify between what is the difference between a misinformation and a disinformation. What is common to both misinformation and disinformation is necessarily it is deliberate or intentional spreading. But what happens in the case of misinformation is that it is a intentional spreading of an accurate information. It can be completely false. But in the case of disinformation, they are also deliberate and intentional spreading. But it can be misrepresenting the actual fact. So there can be partial truth in it, and it can also be partially fake. So all these is what happens. It has given to a new phenomenon. What China calls it nothing new but the propaganda by another name. So what happens? The primary strategy. What happens is that China employs is that the primary strategy is to utilize the existing confirmation biases and the social biases which are inherent to the human mind. There are many confirmation bias in psychology, like confirmation bias, anchoring bias, misinformation effect, self-serving bias, etc. So the users are more likely to believe disinformation that affirms their pre-existing belief than they are also prone to sympathizing with disinformation that reinforces in-group or out-group dynamics. This is a very significant aspect. So also what happens is that due to the social media's own technological bias, due to the the setup of the algorithms are more designed to elevate the content, because whatever becomes popular, they tend to spread quickly, even without relying whether it is truth or fake, even without relying on those aspects, it tends to spread and the contents are elevated. So what happens is that this only makes the effort easier to spread the content, though they may not be necessarily correct. Furthermore, the social media platform, though already banned in India, like the TikTok and Hilo, etc., what they do is that they carry the additional weakness of privileging content from users, friends, and spreading of disinformation peddlers who can acquire friendship with users with only just a few clicks. So why do generally nations or anything they resort to these kinds of technique? One is because of the asymmetry it tends to create, and most second thing is it tends to create confusion. It muddles public debate, creating misinformed opinions, kindling inflated emotions in the process. What happens is that clearing such a confusion becomes a much more difficult task and also a costly and time-consuming affair. One lesser-known aspect, which was also brought up by Professor Kamakoti sir in his presentation, is about this little-known organization. What is the United Front Work Department under the Chinese Communist Party? So under Xi Jinping, this UFWD has become a potent weapon for supporting and the rejuvenation of the great Chinese dream, as brought up by President Xi Jinping in various speeches. So under his leadership, the United Front Works Department has drastically expanded and elevated within the party and rose in ranks. It gathers intelligence on, manages relations with, and attempts to influence both individuals on organization, both inside as well as outside China, whom it considers or who holds social, commercial, or academic influence, or who represents the interest groups, which the Chinese Communist Party feels that they are very significant to in propagating its ideals and philosophy. Moving on to the next concept, which is called the subliminal messaging. So subliminal messaging is nothing but a kind of perception that any information that you receive from your senses, that you will not be consciously aware, but subconsciously it will be happening which you will not be aware of. So it can necessarily be a signal or a message, that is designed to pass below the normal limits of perception. Many a time, these are very used much in the commercial advertisements. Where one example that I can give is where the color red, many of the time it is used in many hotels because they say, according to psychology, the color red tends to kindle our appetite. So we tend to eat more when we visibly get confronted with the color red. So though it might be inaudible to the conscious mind, but an image or a message that is briefly transmitted unperceived consciously, yet it is perceived unconsciously. Another significant example that I can give you is about every time during the Wuhan virus pandemic times when we call anyone, we get to get a recorded message that we need to wear a mask and everything. When the same thing gets repeated over and over and over again, it tends to bring in a sort of positive behavioral pattern which someone wants. Moving on to the next slide, how China has employed the subliminal messaging techniques. One is through the Chinese posters, which are Chinese, as you all know, communism has the popular culture of the what the posters convey is nothing but just the propaganda arts. So where the party tends to convey how its citizens or the people should behave. So this propaganda art continued to be seen as one of the major means to explain and illustrate the correct policies of the moment and the Chinese Communist Party's visions of the future. It reinforces the messages passed on by other media such as the newspaper, films, radio broadcasting, and other media. It also serves a twin purpose of serving as a documentary evidence of political, social, and cultural discourses of the Maoist period, and have resonances of significance beyond national boundaries of China. So this significant poster, as you can see a group of people with the Chinese communist flags and the larger-than-life image of Mao standing there. So what it tends to convey is that Mao is larger than life leading the country. He's a superhuman figure overseeing the immeasurable crowds of his faithful supporters leading the country. So following on the same footsteps, now we can see Xi Jinping also following the same pattern. You can see the Chinese flag there, Xi Jinping waving, all the military, the aircraft carriers and everything there. What it tends to convey. As a general secretary, you can see the Chinese flag there. As the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, he is also the president of the PRC and the commander-in-chief of the PLA. So this authority is now considered to be an encompassing of Mao's boss. And many observers, we all know, as he's observed both within and outside, he's seen to be the new Mao by usurping of power and eradicating the term limits and everything. The next aspect that I'd like to touch upon is China's panda diplomacy. In a simple way, though pandas are known to be cute and cuddly, but in China, they also play a very significant part of the China's international relations. So what is panda diplomacy? To give a very short brief, it is the act of loaning a panda to another country. It's called panda diplomacy. So China, as a part of its transaction international relations, use panda as assets in cultivating relations. So this has happened in three different phases. Initially, in the 1950s, what has happened was China used to gift pandas to other countries that it sees that it wants to cultivate ties with. So originally, after multiple phases, now the second phase, what China has done is that it tends to rent pandas to countries. So I think in 1950s and 60s, China started to give panda to the then USSR, and then the famous 1970 presented to Richard Nixon in 1970s. And post 2012, what has happened is that the third phase, where China gave pandas to countries from which it needs a resource or a technology rather than the trade deals with. So it is like China associating pandas with the long-term trade deals with countries which were providing technology or product China deals. So overall, if you look at the trends of the Chinese panda diplomacy, what it has brought to China, is that it has promoted confidence in Chinese manufacturing and as well as confidence in the Chinese products in the export market. This is one significant aspect that it has paid rich dividends to China as a part of its panda diplomacy. So the second case study that I would like to present to you is about the curious case of the Kung Fu Panda. We all know the movie Kung Fu Panda, where the panda is nothing but the national animal of China, which is there only in China. China severely restricts it ensures that pandas it's bred and done everything only in China by controlling the numbers and its population. So the Kung Fu Panda movie was released in three different parts: Kung Fu Panda 1, 2, and 3. The name of the character, the hero of the Kung Fu Panda movie is a panda, which is called Po. The first part you can see Thailand, it's a snow leopard. The second part, the peacock which you see, the white peacock which you see there is Lord Shen. And the third, like a bull of sorts which you see there is Thai. So what actually has happened is that both the peacock is a national animal of India. And the third, the bull of sorts which you see there, it's nothing but, it's a state animal of the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. It's called Mithun in Arunachal Pradesh. It's a state animal of Arunachal Pradesh. So significantly, in producing the movies, Kung Fu Panda 2 and 3, China has played a direct role in that, because the Oriental Dreamworks of China, it's a Chinese-American studio, has produced the Kung Fu Panda 2. And the Kung Fu Panda 3 even had a very direct role of China. The Shanghai Pearl Studios produced the Kung Fu Panda 3. So what actually it tends to propagate is that the Chinese ideas of value. In part 2, what happens is that Lord Shen, the peacock, intends to conquer China, and then Po comes into the picture and saves China. And same is the case with third part of that. What it all tends to show us a part of the subliminal message that Panda is good, peacock and the animal, the Mithun, which is the Kai, is bad. So China is good, the other countries are bad. It tends to also project a subliminal messaging of the peaceful rise of China. You know what, we are not really bad, we are not as you want to think us to be. So these are the kinds of things that China has tried to propagate as a part of a soft power strategy or subliminal messaging, what I would call. Next, I would like to touch upon the aspect of China's integrated network electronic warfare. The China has this unique concept of this INEW, which goes far beyond the pure technical domain of cyber and electronic warfare, because in the Western democracies, it is left to the respective militaries to take care of this cyber and electronic warfare. The rest is left to other civilian organizations. But in China, everything is under the hands of the military. So what the Chinese approach aims to take is that the initiative, they effectively destroy what it aims to do is that they take the initiative and effectively destroy the enemy's electronic information system, break down the military and civilian communication, paralyze the decision-making apparatus. There's a decision-making paralysis, manipulate the perceptions of various foreign target audience to facilitate the attaining of political objectives in the conflict and propagating the visions and ideals of the Chinese Communist Party. Next is, I would like to touch upon all these aspects were brought about in the book called Unrestricted Warfare, which was produced by the two Chinese colonels in 1999. So what we can learn from all this is that the Chinese approach is a much comprehensive approach. It advocates all activities of non-contact warfare as well as kinetic for the disruption of adversaries' civilian network, manipulation of public perception, as well as the computer attacks as a part of the military drilling. With the permission of the chair, can I just play a small clipping for the deepfakes? It's just a 35-second clipping with the permission of the chair. Can I, sir?
Yeah, yes, Bala, quickly.
Yes, sir. I'm just going to wind up, sir. Thank you, sir. I'm just going back to my presentation. Is my presentation visible, sir?
Yeah, Bala, come.
Thank you, sir. So the video that you saw just now was a classic case of deepfake. It is a tailored video, not an original one. So just to give you a glimpse of what a deepfake is all about, deepfakes are nothing but a synthetic multimedia approach where a person's original voice or appearance is manipulated, and his words are attributed which they didn't say or act or they didn't perform. So what are the future technologies that is going to enable the deepfakes is artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, as well as robotics, though not directly related to deepfakes. It's going to increasingly influence the lives of the future. So we live in a realm or an arena or a temporal scale where the basic needs have an added item like food, water, clothing, as well as internet, which we have now. So these deep voice media, what they do is that these makes a manipulated media flawless and easy to create, which deceive viewers into believing the events that didn't take place. So the deep voice media, on the other hand, relies on it clones a person's voice using machine learning, which could be used to create an entirely new speech in their original voice without consent for information. So since the use of deepfakes and decoys on Chinese social media, as well as the artificial intelligence are not unprecedented, these tools figure prominently figure the Beijing's China cyber warfare, showing China is what it all tends to show is that China is likely to rely on the artificial intelligence generated disinformation content such as deepfakes and decoys videos as a part of the PSYOPs, psychological operations, and influencing the public opinion warfare across the world, as signified by the high volume of mentions of these terms in a PLA academic journal, which is the Military Correspondent. Just to give you a brief timeline, in October 2018, the Strategic Support Base 311, which is in charge of the Chinese Communist Party's PSYOPs Warfare Division, authored an article addressing the need for a voice information synthesis technology, which is nothing but deepfakes. And consequently, in 2019, Paitu announced the creation of its Deep Voice project, which can clone voice and audio within minutes. And as of 2020, the ByteDance, which is the parent of the TikTok, was reportedly developing a deepfake technology that the app refers to as FaceSwap. So what all this entails? This capability, what happens is that it would entail a biometric scan of a user's face, which the user can then apply to a variety of videos which they think would like to apply to their face and do such things. So the PLA could use the artificial intelligence and big data to improve and influence the public opinion, detection, determination, handling, especially for sensitive topics. Ultimately, all this would lead to a comprehensive and intelligent information dissemination model. So several governments, including the many US states, have sensed the threat and enacted laws against the possible misuse of deepfakes. Unfortunately, in India, there are no specific laws governing the deepfakes as yet. So coming to to conclude my presentation, the conclusion, I'd like to touch upon why it matters, because China as an authoritative regime has tended to exploit the openness of liberal democratic societies. Coupled with the digital revolution, it has made it easier to flood open the public spheres with misinformation and disinformation. So what all it tends to do is that it tends to undermine the democracy, reduce people's trust on democratic institutions, undermining the vigilant civil society organizations, restricting freedom of press, undermining credible information, and spread of misinformation and disinformation would increase. China's interference has also thrown attention to the long-standing and complicating subject of malign foreign influence operations. It tends to exploit the openness of values of democracies like openness, transparency, and etc. And when considering the capabilities of China under the current leadership, President Xi Jinping stands as the most immediate concern and a threat, because generally these authoritarian regimes have always seized upon an opportunity or see for vulnerabilities as a setbacks within the liberal democracies to bolster the image of alternative autocratic model of political and economic governance on a global scale, which they have been exporting to many African states now. So this also, the hybrid warfare model also throws up many challenges in the arena, because it is a well-known fact that social media now plays a very crucial role. Social media is increasingly being seen as acting as a nervous system of news, because we generally don't give news, rather we look for we give views, not news. So considering all these aspects, the information warfare has assumed a very central space in the spectrum of conflict, like the Army, Navy, Air Force, space, and cyber domain. The information warfare has assumed a critical space in the spectrum of conflict involving military, but as well as extending to the civilian establishments also. So being a part of the modern warfare, what the need of the hour is framing of new doctrines, new structures, besides giving adequate skill development, is set to give a major push to the information warfare in the country, which is the need of the hour. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala. Good research, and you brought out some points that I think many of us are not even aware of. I especially liked the case about the curious case of the Kung Fu Panda. That was quite interesting. So more power to your research, I think, but more seriously, it looks at how China continues to use unfair and foul means to dominate the flow of information. So thank you, Bala.
Thank you.
So welcome, Mr. Paneerselvan, and sorry to keep you waiting. As I mentioned earlier, we'll quickly move on. Let me introduce Mr. Paneerselvan, who's a good friend of mine, and he's also very supportive of our programs at the Press Institute of India. As many of us know, Mr. Paneerselvan is the readers editor of The Hindu, and we are used to seeing his weekly column in the newspaper. He's also the executive editor, the executive director of Panos Southeast, South Asia. Apart from being a regular columnist, he is also a journalism teacher and is an adjunct faculty at the prestigious Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. With wide experience in both print and television journalism, Paneer is a board member of the Organization of News Ombudsman and Standards Editor representing Asia. He was a fellow of Reuters Journalism Fellowship Program in the University of Oxford in 1998. And earlier he had served as the steering committee member and vice chair of the Global Forum for Media Development between 2005 and 2018. Paneer, of course, has written extensively about fake news. In fact, he was there as one of the speakers when we had a program on fake news in the health field. And we will now look forward to listening to him talk about what fake news is all about, possibly how the Hindu newspaper has managed to handle it, the Hindu newspaper and its team of editors, and what is his take on the subject. Over to you, Paneer.
Unmute. Yep, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, Paneer.
Yeah. Thank you from Mr. Balasubramaniam, because you managed to bring in the two categories, the disinformation and misinformation. In journalism, what we do is we have three categories with reference to the fake news. One is disinformation, second is misinformation, and third is malinformation. Disinformation, as you rightly pointed out, is the information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person or a social group or an organization or a country. Misinformation is false, but it may not have been created out of any intention. It can be due to laziness, it can be due to oversight, and it can be due to essentially a human frailties. Whereas the most important one is malinformation, where the information is based on reality, used to inflict harm on a person, social group or organization or a country, where you use partial truth and build a very, very dangerous narrative. There was a study done by the Reuters Institute which looked into this entire question of fake news, and it said, why do we have to elevate them as news when it is fake? What prevents us from calling it a simple old English word called lies? And here the idea of not calling it lies but fake news is that it has a veneer of being a news because it is being attributed to somebody. And then they did a content analysis based on three major developments. One was the US presidential election in which Trump got elected. Second was the Brexit negotiations from the UK side, as well as the referendum which led to the Brexit. There were these three things they analyzed, and they did a complete content analysis. And what they discovered is 90% of the misinformation and malinformation were generating from the top. Prime ministers, presidents, their advisors were all part of vitiating a credible information media. It's very easy to shift all the blame to the platforms like Facebook or Twitter. But what happened with the Facebook or Twitter is that they actually amplified the misinformation and the malinformation which came from the top. And in the case of Brexit, every amplified misinformation and malinformation can be traced back to either Sun or Mail. And the Sun or Mail had somebody to which it is attributed, and that the attributable source is a person who was wielding power. This we have to keep in mind, and unless and otherwise we understand that misinformation and malinformation are coming from the top, we may not be able to address it fully. And second thing is, I make a minor distinction between vitiating the information ecology from the authoritarian regimes versus vitiating the information ecology from the democratic regimes. In authoritarian regimes, when they are vitiating it, we are able to see it clearly as vitiating the authoritarian regime, vitiating the information, credible information systems. Whereas in the democratic environment, it comes as a freedom of expression. That is the most important one. And yeah, in my mind, we have systems to look at authoritarian regimes with necessary cynicism and skepticism. But we don't have the necessary cynicism and skepticism to look at misinformation and malinformation coming out in the democratic institutions and in the democratic environment, where the idea of the freedom of expression gives space for deliberate distortion of truth. The problem is we conflate freedom of expression with the freedom to lie. We conflate the freedom of expression to distort. We conflate the freedom of information to deflect. Unless another, and this can be understood by three specific cases. One is called the Macedonian fake industry. I would like all of you to actually do this complete study. Financial Times did this exhaustive study on how North Macedonia had become the epicenter for fake news because they generate so much of revenue in that small country due to the Silicon Valley companies. In 90% of the Facebook posts, which were amplified by the Trump campaign team, came from Macedonia. And there is a complete coverage of this. BBC did the follow-up. New York Times did the follow-up. But the story was broke by, the first media organization to break the story was Financial Times. But what we have to keep in mind is democratic institutions use some leeways in the name of freedom to condone the excesses in the information sphere. Unless and otherwise we understand the public sphere is sacrosanct and we should respect its integrity, we are going to be in real trouble because we cannot permit the freedom of expression to vitiate that sanctity of the public sphere. And this also gets completely endorsed by Edward Snowden's book, Permanent Record. It's, as I said earlier, Balasubramanian's research is extremely important and interesting, but we always approach authoritarian regime with certain amount of care, with certain amount of caution. But we tend to be lax, or we tend to grant more leeway for the democratic establishments. For instance, how much did we do in the case of Cambridge Analytica? I will tell you the specific case. After the Cambridge Analytica story was broken and when the Facebook appointed its oversight committee and everything else, India's Minister for Information Technology, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, in 26 June 2018, declared that India would immediately investigate into the Cambridge Analytica's excesses. And he said this in the parliament. But till date, no credible investigation has been done. Therefore, this is the problem. Here we are permitting these three Silicon Valley giants Facebook, Twitter, and Google to do a parallel harvesting of data. And their harvesting of the data is much higher. And it's also having an impact on the way Indian news environment is working. I handle complaints for this newspaper called The Hindu. And what we notice is the transatlantic supporters of the present government become extremely active between early morning 2 to early morning 6 of India time. Whenever there's a critical article against the government, we get about 700 to 800 complaints between morning 2 to 6. And we wanted to know how did they manage to pull out these articles. Then we discovered that they have something called the Hive, which has specific attributions to pick up. Therefore, it's the institution to which I'm associated with. Say, for instance, JNU. Then pick that name and attack the person. And the most interesting thing was 2018 Union Budget. Hindu carried 8 essays evaluating the Union Budget. And the most scathing attack on the Union Budget came from Mr. C. Rangarajan, and who was attributed in the newspaper as C. Rangarajan, former advisor to the Prime Minister of India and former Governor Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India and advisor to the Prime Minister is not in that Hive list of picking up the person and attacking them. But JNU was there. There were 2 economic professors from JNU who wrote the piece, got all the flack. But when you read the piece, Mr. C. Rangarajan's piece was more devastating and more scathing in its attack. Therefore, this is how the structure is working. I think when we are doing this study, we should balance between the brute power of China and its support by the state itself with the brute power of Silicon Valley and the financial muscle it has. We should not permit one to subsume the other, and we have to approach both of them evenly. Unless and otherwise we approach them evenly, we may not be able to get to the bottom of it. Another important thing is in the democracies, what happens? When the phone hacking story happened in the UK, it was followed by Justice Levison's report. What happened to Justice Levison's report? Why is it not being implemented? It was being completely subverted by the democracy. Therefore, let's not romanticize one form of governance or the other form of governance in the area of fake news, in the area of misinformation, in the area of disinformation, because what we need is a responsible behavior towards public sphere. A responsible behavior to the public sphere as the classic idea of public good. Unless and otherwise, people who come into the public sphere and who put out the information in the public sphere respect the idea called public good, it's going to be a major problem. And this is not being divided between the ideology of democracy and authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you, Paneer. Maybe you can just stay on till Namrata finishes. There might be some questions.
Yes.
Particular references you made, which are very pertinent indeed, mentioned about the public sphere being sacrosanct. You just now spoke about public good. Journalists and editors having the need to be aware of that, and even the other people who are running the country. You mentioned no credible investigation having been made into Cambridge Analytica, and also the Justice Levison's report, and very interestingly, the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Complaints that the Hindu has tried and discovered. So thank you for making those points and being plain spoken about them. I request you to hold on. Yes. We'll move on to Namrata. Are you there, Namrata?
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah, hi. So, Namrata, maybe you can round off this session with your take on the threats from misinformation warfare.
Yes, definitely. So Chinese military doctrines, often state that the first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules and nothing is forbidden. There is a tactic known, in which has its roots in Chinese folklore, Sha Shun Jian, or assassin's mace. It is the concept of taking advantage of an adversary's seemingly superior conventional capabilities by fighting the fight that fits one's own weapons and making the weapons also to fit the fight. I think that's very pertinent when we talk of information warfare and the threats from China. It proposes ignoring traditional rules of conflict and advocates such tactics as manipulating foreign media, flooding enemy countries with drugs, controlling the markets for natural resources, joining international bodies so as to be in a position to bend them to one's will, and engaging in cyber warfare. China is doing all of that, whether it is supporting Pakistan at UNSC, getting patents on Indo-Tibetan medicines at the UNESCO, outsmarting India, which I recently witnessed in my, during my trip to Ladakh, and I'll touch upon that soon. Or it's trying to manipulate the media against, we should really look at what are the real-time threats against Dalai Lama, discrediting the Tibetan government in exile, or targeting, the Indian media. And there are neither any rules nor any restrictions in this game. That's the key here. So as and the speaker was touching upon, unfair and foul means very direct and sometimes very submersive means. So to begin with, I have my own personal experience of how really China wants to manipulate. So I was saying that, to my surprise, I was, we talk of information warfare, we talk of fake news. We think these are indirect means, and, these will either happen through technology and not really human interface. But what China is doing is a complete, a complete picture. They're not leaving out anything. As I said, that there are no rules really. And so I was then asked about, and I really wondered what the Chinese would really want to know. What's the kind of information they really want to plug in the media so that tomorrow we carry that, which can have a ripple effect on so many things. So the only thing they were really wanting to know from me is, how is the health of the Dalai Lama? So repeatedly, the only question asked was in various ways was just that, and that would drive how the Tibet issue is dealt with tomorrow, and how India's relations with other countries, or with China for that matter, or the U.S. intervention, as they've supported the Indian stance as far as Tibet is concerned, as far as the Dalai Lama is concerned. So that was one way. Whatever information I realized at that time would have been said, could have been construed, manipulated, and used, as rightly pointed out, disinformation, not really misinformation, but concocted information through lies, through how really fake news on the ground is really created. So those were some of the experiences. At another time, I would like to share that after that, I wanted, for example, I wanted an interview of a Chinese official. I won't be naming. So the response after a long time I really got from the Chinese was, you need to promise us that you will not carry views, this is direct, not carry views of traitors. In this context, the Tibetan government in exile, and not just in one edition of your magazine, but all editions in future. Then of course, this was a vocal demand, outrightly rejected by the foreign media. In this case, me, I'm sure there are many others who would have had similar experiences. Then of course, there are more vocal, more subversive means of information warfare. So what the PLA has actually done is, they have a centralized space, cyber, electronic, psychological warfare under a new organization called the Strategic Support Force, created in 2015. So when we talk of our cyber structures, we also, and information warfare, we need to look at the structures created by China and the restructuring they have done to remedy their operational coordinations that can not just dominate, in the media, but also be in close coordination with the military strategies. When something like Galwan happens, or when there's a threat on the border, how the flow of information or during a COVID crisis will be controlled by a centralized force. Chinese influence operations are conducted by the United Front Work Department. It's a network of academic, business, cultural institutions located domestically and abroad. Uh, I'll go back to the UNESCO example. During my visit to Ladakh just a month ago, I happened to visit, the people who really have done research, the National Research Institute of Soa Rigpa, for example. So at the UNESCO, Soa Rigpa is, part of the intangible cultural heritage as far as India is concerned. China has challenged the Indian claim at the UNESCO meeting last year, where they've, cited the territorial dispute, and they said that the patent lies with them. So we try to submit a lot of evidence, saying that it's the form of the Buddhist literature. So I'm giving this example saying how China really linked it up to battling COVID. They said these medicines would cure COVID. And they're citing instances in the media trying to say that this is the COVID cure. This is their own. So they don't just achieve one, success out of building this kind of disinformation and misinformation, where they're also seeking, cultural claim, a patent. If they do that, they're successful in their military strategy, they're successful in a cultural strategy. The menace is much larger than just information dissemination. It would go on to strategic and other aspects and military aspects, which we sometimes, don't understand the link between the non-warfare strategies of China, where information dissemination and media is a huge part of. So it's important to analyze how China really got here. Analyzing China's information strategy is important, as it does not only mean analyzing the enemy to defeat it, but to understand it and build one's own capabilities to try and exceed or at least surprise the opponent. So this is how it all began. Chinese information researchers had begun to congregate at a series of high-level meetings. In 1994, the Commission of Science, Technology and Industry for National Defense, they sponsored a very harmless symposium entitled Analysis of the National Defense System and Military Technological Revolution, which was slowly followed in a 1995 meeting that dealt with the issue of military revolution. So the alleged high point of this Chinese information research was then in 1995 in December, a national directors conference where one of the key Chinese military strategists said that information warfare and electronic warfare are of key importance, while fighting on the ground can only serve to exploit the victory. Hence, China is more convinced, they said, than ever, that as far as the PL is concerned, a military revolution with information warfare as the core has reached the stage where efforts must be made to catch up with and overtake the rivals. In 1997, then a 100-member elite core group was set up under the CMC to ideate ways of not just hacking into American and European computer systems, but also, information warfare strategies. And ever since then, this initiative has been making, according to them, wonderful progress in acquiring cyber warfare capabilities. So the PLA has been creating its own information militia since 2002. These units have personnel from the commercial IT sector and academics. This initiates that an operational nexus exists between the PLA and the Chinese civilian information security professionals. So the Chinese in the last 20 years or so, they're talking of something called information war, a new age warfare based on information technology to enhance military capabilities, as I was saying. Information technology, we would feel that it's only the digital sector or the IT sector. What about the Chinese army posts? So how do they really do it? Where do they collect information? Is it only, deep penetration into the hinterland? Is it also done on army posts? So an example of recent inroads China has really made on border on the LSC is how these Chinese army posts have big domes close to the LSC where they're fitted with radars that have come up in the last 1 decade. These are called radomes. They are basically radars with a data wall meant to keep gathering information. In other words of two PLA authors, as I was reading, the key to gaining the upper hand on the battlefield is no longer mainly dependent on who has the stronger firepower, but instead depends on which side discovers the enemy first, responds faster than the latter, and strikes more precisely. And all of it is not just based on the military capabilities, as I was saying, but also intelligence, command, control, which will come with information gathering in the border areas, the kind of information they would spread. Earlier, we used to say that, you have airwaves, Pakistani airwaves. If you just take the example, the radio signals can come right in. So now we can imagine, with the digital revolution and the use of technology on the borders, the kind of information or misinformation and they can create, which can have a lot of rippling effect in terms of taking two countries at a real, in a stand-up position. Just as we're seeing in Ladakh, we've not really seen the use of this technology, but in future that's going to be a huge threat. On the other hand, even in recent months, now when we talk of the COVID pandemic, I would just once again refer to it as the biggest example of how they've used, the front line of information warfare and misinformation here. The general narrative that the world today believes is, and it goes like this: there are doubts about the origin of the virus still, and China has demonstrated its effectiveness in managing the crisis. All the reports, either blocked about how much the COVID has really affected China. What is, what kind of COVID impact it has happened in India. They have been able to drive the narrative. And lastly, the most, astonishing thing I feel is it's like they have also, in a way, shown that the authoritarian system has been validated in terms of how they've been able to manage the pandemic. So in response to how ineffective, a democratic system can be. So these are the kind of thoughts through the social media or through even media reports and the kind of media management and misinformation has, done. And in times to come, this would drive the, various other forms of, information dissemination. So a few years ago, a study was carried out where it was estimated that 50,000 analysts in Chengdu in China have been solely stationed to probe and focus on India and its repositories, including the cyberspace. China is said to have conducted passive surveillance of Indian cyber networks. Chengdu hosts the headquarters of the Western Theater Command. So here comes, the link between the military and the information dissemination, where they've really clubbed it as part of a military strategy. And and that is what drives its policy with the, Western Theater Command from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. And now we also have to look at how not just China in isolation, because, geographical boundaries have really blurred, and China and Pakistan coming together is the real threat that we really need to look at. So if we talk of information warfare, we cannot really leave Pakistan out of it, because a lot of misinformation driven by the Pakistan ISI, I feel, is also, further controlled and spread by the Chinese and vice versa. So cyber warfare as planned by the Chinese can take the whole nation down if they target critical infrastructure. During a military cyber conflict, it can hit the nerve center and not, just be limited to a certain kind of bringing down our, various sectors, but also the kind of narrative they will drive with it. And with this said, we have been doing a lot of work on this area. The DRDO is working towards having safeguards in this area, but we need a more centralized way, a more thoughtful approach towards how to counter misinformation. Of late, we have a lot of work that is happening in towards how to counter misinformation, but I see the capacity in my own experience with, either the Defense Ministry, the information wing of, the Ministry of Defense with the ADGPI office doing a lot of work, with our other agencies doing a lot of work. There is no really synchronization between how all these bodies can really coordinate and have a counter-offensive approach, or not just a defensive approach towards misinformation. What we try and do in the cyberspace or on the Twitter are really basic ways of countering, the misinformation by China. We try to create simple things, like we try to create trolls, we try to create news stories that will have an impact. One or two of them really have, some kind of an impact on how the social media or the Twitter is largely being flooded by China on how information and news is being consumed by the world. So we really need to work on that. And when I was talking of the SFF, I would like to point out that this is not just combining the cyber defense capabilities in one organization. They have really been able to overcome all the bureaucratic hurdles and created this central command under the PLA. So the SFF is now in the midst of transferring all cyber missions units to something called the Network Systems Department. And it's a theater command leader who's leading a graded organization that acts as headquarters for the SFF Cyber Operations Force. And it's, compared to that, the kind of strategy we have for countering misinformation is very limited. So I would like to say that, I guess I'm, through with my 15 minutes. Cyber warfare capabilities can serve as a significant force multiplier when complemented with conventional warfare. The PLA military doctrine is a useful insight on how effective information operations and cyber warfare in modern conflicts can really drive the narrative. So thank you very much. I think I've made some points.
Yeah, thanks, Namrata. I think you got into some specifics, and of course, it's been quite enlightening. I don't want to dwell too much on individual presentations, but thank you all very much. I'm just deputizing for Commodore Vasan, who we haven't been able to connect yet. I don't know whether he's here, but I think I will pass this on to Suresh. He had an earlier question, and he has one on the chat, I think in the chat box. If you can again repeat that for the benefit of all, then I think Mr. Paneer can take it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. Nair. Mr. Paneerselvam, I was actually talking about the way you spoke about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Today, when you look at any information which comes to us either in the media, printed media, or the television, or even on the social media, it is very well packaged for us to distinguish or differentiate between whether it is true or false. But how do you classify this? And in a country like ours, if we have to find and fix this problem, what would your recommendations be? I mean, how do we go?
Sir, this is really a challenge because in the last 6 or 7 years, we are finding the news industry under severe financial strain. With a financial strain in the news industry, what we witness is that instead of having domain experts in-house, we are relying more on the domain experts from outside. For instance, let's use a non-controversial area called sports. Earlier, we used to have a great tennis writer in our office. Now, to get about tennis, we get a former Davis Cup player to write on it. For cricket, instead of having a great cricket writer in-house, you get a former test players to write on it. On banking, instead of having a banking expert within in-house, you go for the former bank chairmen. And in the strategic affairs and in diplomatic affairs, we go to the former serving officers or to the former diplomats. There is a distinction here. When it was an in-house expertise where the media had resources to invest on it, there was a critical distance between the establishment and these experts. Unfortunately, if you are going to be the part of the establishment, you tend to amplify the establishment's concern or at that given moment. That critical distance is lacking. And this cleavage grew after 2008, 2009, when the digital disruption actually sucked out the revenue from the newspaper industry. Therefore, that is one major issue. I am not going to get into it beyond a point because it is the financial strain means you are not able to recruit, and some of the experts who retired have not been replaced. I do not want to get into other publications. With reference to our publications, we had a rural affairs editor called Sainath. After Sainath's retirement, we don't have a rural affairs editor. After CRL Narasimhan's retirement, we don't have a banking editor. Therefore, there is certain amount of impoverishment of domain expertise in the newsroom, which is affecting. That's a reason certain misinformation and malinformation get into those pages. Because the filtering needs certain amount of expertise to do that. That is one element. But after this entire question of fake news becoming a major one, journalists need to develop a set of new skills and strategies to work in this ecosystem. They also need to fend off attacks on their work being labeled as biased. One technique which the editors across the world joined together and came up with is called the truth sandwich. In this truth sandwich method is you understand there is a tipping point beyond which you can't ignore a news. Say if there is going to be a distortion which is coming from President Trump or Prime Minister Johnson or Prime Minister Modi, you can't afford to ignore it. You can't say, why are you amplifying something which is not right, correct, which is not true. Therefore, what you do is you have to acknowledge that the person at the top had said it, but you sandwich it with a factor which is based on truth, and then you say the statement made by the reader, and then you say why you don't think it's right. Therefore, this truth sandwich is one method which is gaining ground right now. Then the biggest problem right now is it's sort of an extremely polarized environment. And we have never seen this level of polarization earlier. And this polarization has something to do with the changing nature of the digital narrative. Till 2010, we called it as digital empowerment. And in fact, the digital empowerment is the one which played a big role even in the Arab Spring. But after 2011, what we are witnessing is digital disruption. And the digital disruption is an extremely important issue. And that's where I think the consolidation of the Silicon Valley companies and the way they harvest our data becomes much more important for us, because quite a lot of us are really plugged into the Silicon Valley systems. We are in Twitter, we are using Google. In fact, even this discussion is on Google. Our email platforms are on Google. Given these facts that the amount of India's plugging in with the Silicon Valley is so much. When I'm saying this, I'm not saying that we are not concerned about the China. Yes, we are concerned about the China, but let's not come up with a formula of one subsuming the other. We have to tackle both these things simultaneously with equal fervor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'll just quickly read out one or two comments, maybe one or two questions that either Paneer or Namrata could take, even Bala could. So one is Colonel Hariharan says China's propaganda warfare is not the same as other countries. It is used on its own population. From brainwashing in the 1960s, it has been professionalized. China is investing in media as part of buying influence in target countries. So let's not confuse it with what emanates from Silicon Valley. The reality is that media is business now, increasingly owned by business oligarchs the world over. In China, the government owns it and it controls information outlets, which makes it far more dangerous. So that's Colonel Hariharan's comment. And he also refers to Namrata laying bare how China's information strategy is based on information warfare tools. There's a question from Dr. Sanjay Tambat. This is to Mr. Paneer Selvan. He says, you spoke about authoritarian tendencies in democracies and need to be aware about both China and California. With the kind of state power China is putting in disinformation and misinformation, can we ignore it? And how can we fight it out? And this how can we fight it out and what can we do is what somebody else, Professor Chengappa, has also asked later on. So can you just answer that briefly, Paneer?
I also have a question.
Excuse me. I am not prioritizing one over the other. All I am trying to say is that let's not become oblivious of the other threat. And the thing is, with China, unless and otherwise we are willing to talk truthfully, are we willing to put out all the issues, what happened in Ladakh on the table? On Ladakh, we have empowered China. They were starting from Ladakh. There's a much larger question here. Therefore, the question is, let's look at both China and Silicon Valley with equal level of skepticism, and both are harvesting data. And in one case, we are willfully handing over the data. In the case of Silicon Valley, they need not have to harvest. We are handing over. The end user, the person who's using these platforms, are actually handing over quite a lot of privacy details. We are enabling the Silicon Valley also. Whereas with China, they have to take effort to harvest. And that's the reason I'm saying that. And what is the relationship between the Silicon Valley and China? Silicon Valley dovetails into the China's request. We have seen Microsoft accepting all the conditions laid by China. We have seen Google accepting all the conditions laid by China. Therefore, the Silicon Valley, the democratic companies, never exhibit spine. Just because of their size, let's not confuse their size with spine. They are the first one to sacrifice the spine for the huge Chinese market. Hence, I think that we have to be very, very careful to address both these issues on an even footing. Otherwise, we will be trapped in this official narrative.
Thank you, Paneer. There is another question which refers to the Hindu. It's not something I would particularly like to bring up, but I don't want to ignore it either. So we'll take it anyway. So this is from Tamar Arasu. He says, in the current situation, how has the Hindu published has published Chinese National Day in a big post? Is it not against our patriotism? That's the question. I will leave you to answer it in any way you like, Paneer.
See, I don't see any problem in it. When Indian publications come out with ads in international publications, Chinese government is coming out with a ad. It's a paid ad, and it has been clearly marked as a paid ad. What is the problem? Is it an editorial output? And are we going to see? We are not talking about loss of a territory in Ladakh. We are not willing to talk about all our, from Doklam to Ladakh, what has happened. And remember, we have an external affairs minister who had been an ambassador to Beijing. And the external affairs minister who had been ambassador to the Beijing under his watch, we are seeing a gradual loss of territory. That is a bigger issue. It's not about one newspaper carrying a paid ad, which has been clearly marked as a paid ad. It's not an editorial content.
Yeah, thanks. That answers it well. Mr. Heblika, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to pick 2 points, just addressed to Mr. Paneer Selvan. During the narrative which we have heard the last hour plus, including your good self, we have not talked about the force multiplier that social media has become. We had this strange problem in Bangalore a few years ago, where a WhatsApp message or a SMS which originated in Pakistan created chaos in Bangalore. That's the first one. We need to understand that the government of India cannot be everywhere at all times. There is a need to understand that the battle for India's internal security is fought in the states. What would be your advice to the state governments that they need also to ensure that their law enforcement agencies are abreast of the latest developments and techniques? And lastly, I think coming from a profession which I did, we have resorted to information warfare We have done things that we have spoken of. But yes, there is a need to evolve. There is a need to invest. I'd like the only institution that can be admired by me today is the Indian military, which has evolved over 200 years and come to its own SOPs. And we need to evolve. We need to bring about a system where we find that we are also in a position to change the narrative as it suits us. So just your comments on these. Thank you.
Sir, as I said earlier, it needs domain expertise to address this. I can talk about the media ethics part, and I never handled these areas. Unfortunately, today, because of the financial stress, we don't have domain expertise on this. And I don't want to venture into an area where I don't have the domain expertise. It is really lies out. If it is about self-regulation in media or about what distinguishes freedom of expression from responsible reporting, I'm willing to take up. But this is really outside my expertise. Therefore, I request you to excuse me.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end it there. Thank you, Paneet, for staying for so long. I think we overstepped the time, quite a bit. Thank you, Namrata. I can't see you, but thank you very much for your inputs all through yesterday and today. We greatly appreciate that. And thank you, of course, Bala, for that wonderful paper that you presented.